Good morning and welcome. Welcome to this virtual and in-person service in the Idaho Falls Unitarian Universalist Church on this 20th of February. We know you come here for different reasons: to find community, to seek your spiritual and personal truths, to question, to nurture your heart and soul, to be nurtured, to explore new ideas, to find comfort, and perhaps to find the answers to some of your bigger questions. We know you come from different places, different religions, different beliefs, and different backgrounds. We hope you will find comfort, connection, challenge, and love here. If you're watching online, please sign in to the chat box so that we may know who is attending, and it will also enable you to enter your joys and concerns so those can be read a little bit later. I am Ron Goen, and I will be assisting Reverend Kevin Carson in this service this morning. The tech person is Vic Allen, and Jessica Hooper will be providing music. The Time for All Ages will be presented by Elizabeth Proglielli, if I pronounce her name correctly. Okay, announcements. Okay, please write any joys and concerns on one of the slips of paper back in the back of the room, and people online, please indicate in your chat box whether you have a joy or a concern so those can be read. We still do not pass the offering plate, so please put any donations in the basket in the back, and people online can make donations on the website, IdahoFallsUU.org. Just click on the button in the upper right-hand corner to make a donation. They can also be mailed via snail mail to UUCIF, Post Office Box 50376, Idaho Falls 83405. Any donations are gratefully received. The other other announcement we have is there's a suggestion box here in the sanctuary for any suggestions for a new name for the Jefferson Room, and people online can send those to Elizabeth at her email address is dree@IdahoFallsUU.org. Are there any other announcements? In that case, here we go. Now let us prepare ourselves for worship. Calm our hearts, our minds, our breathings. Breathe deeply in and out, listening to your breath as I ring the peace bowl 3 times. I missed my cue there, obviously. One announcement I forgot was please silence any cell phones. I just happened to think of that one too. Okay, our church's covenant helps us remember why we are a part of this faith and why we give our time and our resources to this congregation. If you so choose, please recite along with me the covenant that this congregation has chosen to live by. Love is the spirit of this community, and service is love. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Ron. Chalice lighting.
Oh, sorry, I didn't turn the page. I'll get it. The chalice lighting is accompanied by the words from Sean Trapp. Our chalice reminds us that the fire within ourselves is the same fire that illuminates the universe. It is our reminder that all is connected, even though the space of the void is vast and our experiences here is but a blip in the cosmic timeline. This flame is our promise that in our smallness and our short time on this earth, that we live intently and deeply with love for one another, with honesty and integrity, to be guided by rational thought and critical thinking, and with a sense of shared responsibility. For, as the late astronomer Carl Sagan reminded us, this pale blue dot is the only home we have ever known.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Our call to worship this morning is from Betty Bobo Seiden. We are here today because we want our religious journey to include more than one holy land, more than one vision, more than one scripture. We sing praises in many styles and in many languages. We make a joyful noise unto whomever nourishes and sustains all life. When we look around us here today, we see the beauty of diversity. People of various sizes and shapes, heads of different colors and textures. We see an age span of several generations. We are aware of personality differences, of differences in perspective, of ancestors who represent every continent on the world. Come, let us celebrate our diversity. Come, let us worship together. I invite you to enjoy our opening hymn, number 148, Let Freedom Span Both East and West.
Let freedom span both east and west, and love both south and north, in universal fellowship throughout the whole wide earth, in beauty
Today's Time for All Ages is called Building Respect. It's from a Tapestry of Faith lesson. And you might think your order of service says that the person we are talking about today is Joseph Jordan, but his name is actually pronounced Jordan. So, when Joseph Jordan was born in Virginia in 1842, slavery was still legal. Most people of African descent were treated as property, like horses or dogs. They were bought and sold. They had no rights. Whether enslaved or free, people of color were not treated with respect. Joseph had been born free in a small community on the Elizabeth River. He learned to read and write. At a young age, he began to work on the river harvesting oysters alongside the men. When he was 21, he moved to the city of Norfolk. Joseph found work, first as a laborer, then as a grocer, and finally as a carpenter, building furniture and houses with his hands. He married Indiana Brown, and they had 3 children and built a new life together. The Civil War had ended by now. Slavery was gone, and many other people also needed to build new lives. Joseph worked hard. He bought land and built more houses, which he rented to other families. But even though people could no longer be bought and sold, true freedom had not yet arrived for African Americans. The laws were unfair, and it was hard for African Americans to find places to live, or good jobs, or schools of any kind. Joseph had become a Baptist minister. And when he preached on Sundays, he sometimes spoke of the sins of the white oppressors and how God would surely punish them by sending them to burn in hell for all eternity. Then a friend gave Joseph a book, The Plain Guide to Universalism, and he read of God's promise of salvation to all, the powerless and the powerful, the oppressed and their oppressors alike. Universalism said that everyone, no matter who they were or what they had done, was a child of God. Joseph also knew that Jesus had said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." So Joseph stopped preaching a message of vengeance, and he began preaching a message of respect and love. Joseph wanted to learn more about the Universalist faith, so he went to Philadelphia to study with a Universalist minister at a Universalist church. The people there treated him as a person instead of a thing, as a fellow child of God, someone worthy of respect. The 7 members of the Universalist Ordaining Council found him to have a clear and bright mind and gave him a unanimous recommendation. On the 31st of March, 1889, Joseph Jordan officially became a Universalist minister, the first African American to be ordained by the Universalist denomination. Joseph returned to Norfolk, Virginia, and opened the first Universalist church of Norfolk in a rented room. He built the pulpit with his own hands. His friend Thomas Wise, who was the second African American to be a Universalist minister, founded another mission in the nearby town of Suffolk. The congregations grew quickly, and with the help of donations from other Universalist churches, the Universalists in Virginia soon built new meeting houses and schools. Dozens of African American children came to learn, for there were few other schools available to them. Joseph knew that education was vital and would help provide people with lives of dignity and purpose. Joseph worked every day, teaching during the week and preaching on Sundays, sharing the Universalist message of God's love for everyone. Joseph Jordan died in 1901 when he was 59 years old. Over many decades, the churches and schools Joseph Jordan helped build gave thousands of families in Virginia a chance to learn and a place to be treated with respect. The end.
Joys and concerns. Reverend Kevin will light a candle as I read the joys and concerns. Victoria McDonald has 2 joys. The warm weather is wonderful, and I hope it brings more snow. We all do. Also, gratitude for friends who helped me with my knee and offered helpful advice for recovery. And Nancy, the 2, how's that? As a sorrow, ask for healing prayers for my daughter Christine, who was in the hospital this week. And David has a sorrow. My beloved sister Kathy passed away yesterday. Please hold her husband and her 2, Renee and Seth, in your hearts and prayers. And Karen Croft has a concern. Hopefully, Russia will withdraw troops and not attack Ukraine. And I have a joy. My granddaughter in Minnesota had her baby boy yesterday afternoon. So I have one more grand. Are there any joys or concerns? No joys or concerns. So we'll light one more candle for those joys concerns or sorrows that we retain in our hearts and are not ready to share.
Our reading this morning is an article that comes from the Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown from December 1947 in the Christian Register. And a few notes before I start the reading. First of all, the language reflects the times it was written in 1947, so it is a bit patriarchal at times and dated. The AUA reference refers to the American Unitarian Association, one of the two precursors of the modern Unitarian Universalist Association. And the Register magazine, which is mentioned, was the Christian Register, which was the main Unitarian periodical of its day. It was actually a weekly, very popular periodical, and is a precursor of our current UU World. At the beginning of my ministry, it was my task to keep the flag of Unitarianism flying in a segregated city within a city, to prove not to the world, but to Unitarians that Negroes are capable of becoming Unitarians, and that therefore Unitarianism is a universal religion. What we had to do was to show that the principles of our free faith are understandable and acceptable to all men, regardless of race. Negroes are not committed to voodoo, fundamentalism, the drum of the jungle. They are thinking, critical, examining men in their religion, just as some white men are. Maybe all this sounds like mere truism today, but even Unitarians, whatever they may have said in easy words, found these truths hard to accept when I began my work more than a quarter of a century ago. It was one thing to try to show the world, but it was quite a different thing to show the Unitarian fellowship already verbally dedicated to the principles of the brotherhood of all men. The principles sounded good. Behind them was little conviction. Even in the Unitarian leadership, official Unitarianism, the words had a question mark in the dark backward and abyss of thought. This initial phase of my task I have been lucky enough to have somewhat accomplished. Unitarians themselves now admit Negroes to the brotherhood of man on grounds of full and unhesitating equality because of their basic humanity. There are still, however, my two dreams to be fulfilled. The first dream of mine is within the same sphere of racial relations within our church. When a majority group enforces segregation on a minority, this enforced segregation is in effect the stamping out of the segregated group with a stigma of inferiority. And if that implication is not justified by the facts, a real and serious injustice is perpetrated. The disturbing fact is that the churches of America approve segregation in the continuing existence of separate churches for whites and Negroes. Our Unitarian churches are a current partner in this sorry business. My first dream is that one day, in the not too distant future, our Unitarian churches will be genuinely interracial. And I mean in their pulpits as well as in their pews. A Unitarian church in Harlem, remember well, in Harlem, will be the first church of its type in this country of ours. Have faith, we say to the AUA and to the readers of the Register. Help us build the church, and the congregation will be assured. This is my second dream, the dream of a man no longer young, a man on the way out. Two dreams, genuinely interracial churches in America and a Unitarian church in Harlem. Dreams? Yes. But some dreams come true. These may. Everyone probably knows that February is officially Black History Month in America. And I thought it'd be a good time to look back on the history of our Unitarian Universalist faith with respect to racial equality and our support for Black ministers and other leaders. I wish it was a time we could celebrate our long, evolving history on the subject with pride, telling our story about overcoming prejudice and growing into the multiracial denomination we are today. Unfortunately, as we can confirm by merely looking around in almost any congregation, this is not the case. Our story is complicated and generally not something to celebrate in this regard. We do have famous UUs that we like to recognize for being strong abolitionists like Theodore Parker, or who marched with Dr. King a century later in support of civil rights. Even some who were martyred for the cause, such as Reverend James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo. But while we should honor such extraordinary people, they were all white. They were important allies in the fight for racial equality, to be sure, but this is a story of a white church that is still overwhelmingly white. No matter how many principles we may adopt or how much we say we want to be a true beloved community that includes people of all colors and identities, we must be honest that our history also includes a lot of systemic racism and sometimes overt racism too. We have missed opportunities in the past to overcome this prejudice and make real progress. And we need to own this part of the story if we want to avoid falling short once again. Dr. King once said that the most segregated hour in Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And though there has been some progress over the last half century, his statement remains essentially true today. King was speaking primarily from within his own Protestant Christian tradition, but the facts confirm that this is largely the case regardless of a religious affiliation, and it is certainly true of our Unitarian Universalist faith. In the most recent data I could confirm, as of 2008, 89% of UUs identified as white, with only 11% identifying as people of color, and those who identify as Black representing a mere 1%. I doubt these numbers have shifted much since 2008, since the prior data from 1997 shows an overall change of only a percent or two in every category. The largest increase among UU people of color has been among those who identify as Hispanic or Latinx. When it comes to church membership, segregation may not be the law of the land the way it once was, but even within a liberal denomination like ours, with a history of confronting racism, the racial demographics are not even close to a reflection of society at large. There are many reasons this remains the case and plenty of room for debate. But this morning, I want to explore three key periods in the history of our faith when there was progress and potential for becoming a much more diverse and welcoming faith, and how our prejudice and missteps prevented it from happening. There are certainly lessons to be learned when we honestly confront the failures of the past, and clearly there is still much work to be done. The three key periods I want to talk about are, first, the early decades of the 19th century through the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. Second, the turn of the 20th century through the end of the Second World War. And finally, the Civil Rights era. There's plenty of history we could talk about before and after each of these periods, but I want to use some specific stories within these time brackets to illustrate some of the complexity and evolution of racial justice attitudes within our faith. I would highly recommend further reading or a class to dig deeper, and there are some excellent resources available these days. What is clear from each of these time periods is that despite the liberal ideals of our faith, in practice, we behaved much as the rest of American society, with few exceptions. For African American spiritual seekers who have been drawn to our faith since its beginnings, building a home among us has been a real struggle. The Universalist Church of America was founded in 1793, and the American Unitarian Association was founded in 1825. These, of course, were the parent organizations that merged in 1961 to become our current Unitarian Universalist Association. From the earliest years, despite the presence of slavery in America, a very small number of African Americans, mostly freed slaves, were attracted to each of our parent denominations, and a few were admitted to membership. This was especially true for the Universalists. One famous example is Gloucester Dalton, who in 1785 was one of 85 signatories who founded the Gloucester Universalist Society in Massachusetts. Another, who is probably the earliest black minister in our faith, was Reverend William Jackson of New Bedford, Massachusetts, who became a Unitarian in 1860 and later served as chaplain for the famous 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment during the Civil War, under the command of Unitarian Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. This was the regiment featured in the movie Glory. But despite a few cases like these, most of our spiritual ancestors were just as racist as their neighbors and wanted nothing to do with integrating their congregations. At best, they might support a separate, segregated black church, but even these efforts gained little traction and rarely came to fruition. There are instances of promising black ministers who tried to affiliate with us during this period, but often left discouraged and returned to more established black denominations like the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And their staunchest allies, the white abolitionist Unitarians and Universalists, who mostly supported integrating the church, were often condemned as being too radical by their contemporaries. Even after the end of the Civil War, when slavery was officially abolished, there was plenty of resistance among the whites to the idea of racial equality and admitting black members into white churches. Although some of our congregations slowly began to admit black members over the next century, even as late as 1963, at the UUA General Assembly in Chicago, a resolution requiring congregations to adopt a non-discrimination clause was defeated. It is hard to believe, but open racial discrimination was considered acceptable by many of our congregations until relatively recent, within my own lifetime. It is right and good that we should celebrate the lives of early black Unitarians and Universalists, such as Reverend Joseph Jordan, whose story you heard this morning. And it is also right and good to honor the white churches that supported such courageous souls in this period. But we should not assume that they were more than rare exceptions in an overwhelmingly racist society. Moving into the next period, spanning the first half of the 20th century, I want to highlight the story of Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown, not just because he had such a wonderful name, but because I think his story represents one of the most egregious examples of how we let racial bigotry derail what could have been the start of a tremendous growth in our movement's history among African Americans. Egbert Ethelred Brown was born in Jamaica in 1875. And after reading a pamphlet on Unitarianism by William Ellery Channing, he converted and founded a Unitarian congregation in Jamaica in 1908. He was an accountant professionally, but felt called to ministry. So he reached out to American Unitarian ministers for advice. He decided to come to America and study at Meadville Theological School, now known as Meadville Lombard, though he had some difficulties getting the proper paperwork in order. He graduated and was ordained in 1912, making him the first official black Unitarian minister to be educated and ordained through the normal process. He soon discovered, though, that no American congregation would even consider calling a black minister in those days. And he was told that he would only be able to pursue his ministry in a black church. Unfortunately, unlike some Protestant denominations who did establish strong ethnic black churches and churches for other minorities, no such Unitarian or Universalist church existed at the time. Discouraged at first, Brown returned to Jamaica, where he worked as a Unitarian missionary in Montego Bay and Kingston for the next 8 years. He was undeterred, however, and so in 1920 he returned to America, settling in Harlem, where he founded the Harlem Community Church. He served that church for the next 35 years. And though the congregation generally thrived, he was burdened by constant financial pressures and reached out to the American Unitarian Association for assistance. Our reading this morning was one of his many appeals to Unitarians to help nurture a black Unitarian church in the heart of New York City's black community. As you might have guessed, they provided only sporadic, minor financial support. And the Unitarian leadership was skeptical about African Americans being attracted to their faith and supporting black ministers in general. From the beginning, the Harlem Community Church became a hub of African American political activism that was considered radicalism by most whites. Black identity groups such as the African Blood Brotherhood and Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, which emphasized race consciousness and the need for black self-defense and self-reliance, found much support among Brown's congregation. But Brown himself did not always support the views of such groups despite his own political activism. Nevertheless, he remained a thorn in the side of the American Unitarian Association, who eventually dropped him from ministerial fellowship in 1929. His fellowship was only reinstated in 1935 after threats of legal action from the ACLU. Not a stellar moment in our history to be proud of. Since there is no thriving Unitarian church in Harlem that would have just celebrated its 100th anniversary, you know how the story turns out. From the correspondence of Unitarian leaders of the day, it is clear that they were as racist as any of their neighbors and had no desire to spread Unitarianism among African Americans. They referred to African Americans in terms like lower classes, shiftless rascals, and having an extraordinary histrionic vein. In one letter, it was argued that it would be an impertinence to spread Unitarianism among them. Brown died in 1956, never seeing his dream of a strong Unitarian church in Harlem being realized. But just imagine if he had. There were a few other similar efforts in Chicago and elsewhere during the first half of the 20th century that also failed to gain denominational support. Had Unitarians been able to overcome their racism despite the bigotry of life in a segregated American society, we might have become one of the largest multiracial denominations in the country. It was another missed opportunity. As the civil rights movement grew in the 1950s and 60s, many UU ministers and laity were quick to embrace the ideals and political activism as allies. Though on the whole, the Unitarian and Universalist churches were slow to support the efforts largely remained in the background like almost all white churches of the day. By the time Selma came along and the Freedom Riders traveled the South, we did show up in strong numbers, and some UUs paid the ultimate price for the cause. By the end of the 1960s, we were firmly in support of civil rights, but black UUs were still a tiny minority. And black ministers still found it extremely difficult to find a congregation to serve. It was common for eager and talented black ministers to be openly discouraged from pursuing fellowship in the UUA because of this situation. Nevertheless, a growing number of black UUs began to organize for change within the denomination, forming the Black Unitarians for Racial Reform in 1967 in Los Angeles, and holding the National Conference of Black Universalists in Chicago in 1968, with 207 attendees. After Dr. King's assassination that same year, the efforts ratcheted up, and two new UU groups were formed, the Black Affairs Council and the Black and White Alternative, which was later changed to Black and White Action. Both groups had similar goals for transforming Unitarian Universalism, though they had some differences in philosophy about getting there. Most fundamentally, Black and White Action focused on ways black and white UUs could work together on racial issues rather than throwing all the denominational support behind a black-centered initiative. At our General Assembly that year, in what was probably a severe financial overreach based on the emotional hopes of UUs rather than realistic policy, the delegates committed to funding the Black Affairs Council with $1 million over 4 years, $250,000 a year, and $50,000 to Black and White Action, despite the objections of the Black Affairs Council. Reality soon took hold, however, when the UUA board realized that they did not have discretionary funds beyond the first year's commitment. The next year, at the 1969 General Assembly in Boston, the issue came to a head, and the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus, which included members of the Black Affairs Council, demanded that the funding issue become the first item on the agenda. When it did not, they famously walked out of General Assembly and convened at the nearby Arlington Street Church. A denominational schism between black and white UUs was narrowly avoided due to some shuttle diplomacy, and the delegates returned to the General Assembly. After the GA delegates voted to adjust the funding schedule to 5 years and to drop funding for Black and White Action, things seemed to calm down. But after the Black Affairs Council disaffiliated from the UUA in 1970, further funding was dropped. We lost many black UUs from membership in the aftermath. So the decade that started with a lot of promise ended in confusion, misunderstanding, and resignation. I think the racial violence and fear in America at the end of the 1960s probably made UUs rush into a commitment they couldn't keep in an attempt to do something quickly in urgent times. And I think we put too little effort into educating the members across the denomination about the issues on both sides before trying to fix the problems. This was a time when ignorance among whites about the lives of black Americans was even more pronounced than today. And African Americans were only beginning to break down barriers in all aspects of society. The pain and disappointment among black UUs after such a fiasco left us still trying to recover the multiracial diversity we seem to be headed toward in the 1960s. Another missed opportunity. So now you've heard a small portion of the story of Black UUs and of the missed opportunities in our faith's history for becoming truly inclusive and multicultural. There are plenty of others. As I said earlier, I would strongly encourage further study if you want to appreciate what is happening in our denomination today. I believe the last few years have presented us with another pivotal moment in history. And I hope we have learned enough from our past mistakes to do a better job this time. So far, I think the signs are promising. And this can be said for American society in general, despite the open racism that has been on the rise and the efforts to roll back voting rights and other legal protections against discrimination. The Black Lives Matter movement and other events have made racism a topic of frequent discussion in the news in recent years like never before. And fortunately, there are now many prominent Black voices in government and in the media to bolster these efforts. Within our Unitarian Universalist movement, we have been making good progress on addressing internal systemic racism and reaching out to UUs across the country with education and opportunities for activism. The efforts to adopt the 8th principle that explicitly addresses racism and oppression is just one example. I see lots of promise that we will get it right this time and not miss another opportunity. There is still plenty of work to do. I admit that sometimes the multiracial group photos you see on the UUA website or in UU World magazine make me a little uncomfortable. Not because I'm against diversity, of course, but because it seems like false advertising. I appreciate that they are trying to depict an ideal that would make more people of color interested in checking out what we have to offer. But I hope that the reality that confronts a non-white visitor at most of our congregations is not so discouraging that we never see them again. It is hard for anyone to brave crossing the threshold of a new congregation, let alone a new religious denomination. Just imagine being a person of color walking into one of our overwhelmingly white congregations. I pray we will always make visitors feel welcome and at ease. We need intentional efforts to dismantle racism and other structures of oppression now more than ever. I'm proud this congregation voted to adopt the 8th principle at the annual meeting 3 weeks ago. And I'm proud of the support that you have shown for Black Lives Matter and racial justice for years, long before you called me to be your minister. Our region of Idaho may not be as multicultural as some places, but there are people who need our support. And the politics here are challenging, to say the least. I'm realistic about the chances of seeing most UU congregations become a mirror of Americans' diversity anytime soon. But I'm hopeful that we will begin to make more progress and not miss the opportunity our turbulent times presents. Like my favorite song by Emma's Revolution says, keep on moving forward, never turning back, never turning back. I invite you to enjoy our closing hymn, number 149, Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing forever in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee, shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
For our closing words today, I want to share a video of Amanda Gorman, America's Youth Poet Laureate, reading her poem, Fury and Faith.
You will be told that this is not a problem, not your problem. You will be told that now is not the time for change to begin, told that we cannot win. But the point of protest isn't winning, it's holding fast to the promise of freedom, even when fast victory is not promised, meaning we cannot stand up to police if we cannot cease policing our own imagination, convincing our communities that this won't work before the work has even begun, that this can wait when we've already waited out 1,000 suns. By now, we understand that white supremacy and the despair it demands are as destructive as any disease. So when you're told that your rage is reactionary, remember that rage is our right. It teaches us it is time to fight in the face of injustice. Not only is anger natural, but necessary, because it helps carry us to our destination. Our goal has never been revenge, just restoration, not dominance, just dignity, not fear, just freedom, just justice. Whether we prevail is determined not by all the challenges that are present, but by all the change that is possible. And though we be unstoppable, if we ever feel like we might fail, if we be fatigued and frail when our fire can no longer be fueled by fury, we will be fortified by this faith found in the vow, the anthem, all Black lives matter no matter what. Black lives are worth living, worth defending, worth every struggle. We must stand up for all of us in our aims, united through protest and pain, amplifying women, the LGBTQ community, and people with disabilities, because none of us are free until all of us break our chains. We owe it to the fallen to fight, but we owe it to ourselves to never stay kneeling when the day calls us to stand together. We envision a land that is liberated, not lawless. We create a future that is free, not flawless. Over and over again and again, we will stride up every mountainside, magnanimous and modest. We will be protected and served by a force that is honored and honest. This is more than protest. It's a promise.
Please join with me in reading the words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.